Welcome back to World Cup history. My name is Lavender Bai, and as always, I am your World Cup historian. Although today it may look like I am naked because I'm wearing a strapless top. So we've made it to the 1970s, and this World Cup is one of the most significant. So far, we've covered dictators, world wars, dogs, witch doctors, stolen trophies, and even the time that England won the thing. But 1970 is different. This is arguably the greatest team to ever play a World Cup. The team that took home the Jules Rimet trophy in perpetuity. This is Pele's last World Cup and perhaps his most significant. But before we get into that story, we need to start where we seemingly always do. In the trenches of war. Roll the tape. So even before the 1970 World Cup begins, one of its qualifying matches starts an actual war. You'd think I'm taking the piss, but the football war was a very brief but very real war between El Salvador and Honduras in 1969. So for context, it's June 1969 and two countries that have never qualified for a World Cup are drawn against each other for one of the region's qualification spots. But there's already a bit of political tension in the air because in the 1960s, approximately 300,000 Salvadoran peasant farmers had relocated to Honduras seeking land and opportunity. By 1969, the Honduran government, facing both economic pressure and political instability, began expelling them back across the border. So this means you've got thousands of Salvadorians forced back across the border into an already overpopulated country. And as you'd expect, tensions between the two nations were at a breaking point. And then we throw a World Cup qualifier into the mix. 3 matches, 1 home, 1 away, and 1 decider on neutral ground. What could possibly go wrong? So the first match, June 1969, and like we saw with Mexico and Ecuador this year, the Honduran fans harassed the Salvadoran team the night before the match, camping out, throwing stones, blowing horns, lighting fireworks, you name it, they were doing whatever they could to keep them awake. And ultimately, it would work. Honduras won 1-0 with the only goal in the final minute. And as a result, Salvadoran fans reportedly set fire to the stadium. The loss was taken catastrophically in El Salvador. So an 18-year-old girl named Amelia Bolaños was watching on television when Honduras scored. She got up, went to the desk containing her father's pistol, and shot herself in the heart. She became a national martyr. The president and his ministers followed the coffin, followed by the Salvadoran football team. And then we have the second game on June 15, which was somehow even more dramatic. The Honduran team arrived to find their hotel's windows already smashed. Their flag was burned outside. They had to be transported to the stadium in armored cars, and the army had to surround the pitch. 3 people would die rioting before the game even kicked off. And this time, El Salvador would win 3-0. And the Honduran fans were kind of relieved to have lost. Their coach said if they'd won, they might not have escaped with their lives. Their supporters were less fortunate. They were pursued through the streets, dozens were hospitalized, and 2 more were killed. And the border was closed. And then we obviously had to go to a tiebreaker match in Mexico on June 26. And as you'd expect, tensions were high. So we're at a neutral venue with 1,700 police in the stands and 2 countries that have already severed diplomatic relations. So after the second game, El Salvador claimed that 12,000 Salvadorans were forced to flee Honduras after the second match, adding that, quote, "The government of Honduras has not taken any effective measures to punish these crimes which constitute genocide." Ultimately, in the tiebreaker, El Salvador would win 3-2 after extra time to qualify. And then on July 3, Salvadoran anti-aircraft guns fired on a civilian plane in Honduran airspace. And then at 6 p.m. on the 14th of July, the Salvadoran Air Force bombed Honduras. The army invaded, and the football war, also known as the 100-Hour War, had begun. It lasted 4 days and killed approximately 3,000 people, overwhelmingly civilian deaths. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced before the Organization of American States negotiated a ceasefire on July 18. So the name The Football War implies that this was about football. It wasn't, but had it not been for that World Cup qualifier, the war very likely would not have happened. This war was rooted in land reform, immigration, poverty, and political instability that had been building for decades. The matches were just the catalyst. El Salvador went to Mexico in 1970 as the first Central American country to qualify for a World Cup. And then they lost all 3 group games without scoring a single goal. A whole war started, 3,000 deaths, and they would ultimately crash out in the group stage. So what was the world like in 1970? Mexico is in the final years of the Mexican Miracle, a period of strong economic growth as a result of industrial expansion and import substitution. For the 8 million people living in Mexico City, the middle class life has never been better, with consumer goods, cars, and TVs accessible to the average Joe for the first time ever. The Olympics had been hosted in Mexico just 2 years earlier, but the memory of that is, well, complicated. Just 10 days before the opening ceremony, the Mexican government massacred student protesters who had been demonstrating against authoritarian rule, inequality, and the government's decision to splurge on the Olympics while poverty ravaged the country. Because that was the other reality for Mexico. For indigenous people and rural communities, the economic boom didn't hit. They were living in poverty under the PRI government, who had an authoritarian rule since 1929 and was not about to give it up. On more of a global scale, this was the first World Cup in North America, the first outside of Europe or South America, and the Mexican fans were excited to welcome the world once again. The Estadio Azteca had opened in 1966 and was the largest stadium on the planet. And the Mexicans were ready to show it off both in real life and on TV as the first ever World Cup broadcast in color globally. In the rest of the world, the Vietnam War is at its peak, the Beatles have just broken up, and Neil Armstrong had only walked on the moon 11 months earlier. And in Brazil, a military dictatorship had seized power in 1964 and was now using football as a propaganda tool like the reincarnation of Benito Mussolini himself. Somehow we always get back to Mussolini. Only 3 months before winning the 1970 World Cup, spoiler alert, Brazil's national team drew 1-1 with a lowly club side called Bangu and were booed off the pitch. Just 99 days later, they would become world champions. Now, this sounds like the comeback of the century, if you ignore the whole dictator thing. So Brazil's military president, Emilio Garrastazu Medici, had seized power through increasingly repressive laws in 1964 in a US-backed coup against President Goulart. And by 1970, his regime was at its most repressive peak. His regime tortured political opponents, censored the press, and disappeared critics like it was nothing else. And like Mussolini, he was also obsessed with football and was smart enough to understand how football can unite a people under nationalism in a way that not even military force could. So naturally, the regime invested heavily in Brazil's 1970 campaign. Training facilities were upgraded, resources flowed freely, and army officers were given jobs in football. So the original coach for 1970 was João Saldanha, a charismatic, outspoken communist journalist who had masterminded Brazil's perfect qualification campaign. And when the team were winning, he was beloved by the regime. But Medici pressured Saldanha on team selection. But Saldanha's response? Quote, "The president chooses his ministry, I choose my team." But when Saldanha dropped Pele from the squad in a friendly against Chile, everything went to shit. A few hours later, CBF officials drove unannounced to a club training session where they told Mario Zagallo to get in the car. He was the new coach. Terrifying way to find out you get the top job, if you ask me. Why? Because Brazil needed Pele, not just on the pitch, but politically. He was the most famous Brazilian on earth, and a World Cup trophy in his hands meant infinitely more than it did out of them. So by the time Zagallo arrived, there was only 75 days to go. And he had a squad containing 5 players who all played the same attacking position at their clubs. So he picked all 5. He also nearly left out Tostão, one of the 5, after concerns about an eye operation he had undergone in Houston before the tournament. Pele personally intervened and persuaded the coaching staff to include him. And he would go on to nutmeg Bobby Moore, score 2 goals and make 4 assists. And he would give his winner's medal to the doctor who operated on his eye. The regime needed a win. A World Cup victory was propaganda gold. And when Brazil won, Medici was photographed holding the Jules Rimet trophy. The regime even had a catchphrase, quote, "Brazil, love it or leave it." And ultimately, the Jules Rimet trophy that was born to unite a people through football was used to unite a people under authoritarian rule. You couldn't celebrate Brazil's World Cup win without also celebrating the regime that built it. And now they got to keep the trophy. This was a propaganda masterclass like no other. The players who gave the regime its greatest propaganda victory were almost entirely black or mixed race. So the same regime that tortured Afro-Brazilian political activists presented the achievement of Pele as evidence of national glory. So what changed at this World Cup? Mexico 1970 marked the start of a new era for football. First up, we have red and yellow cards for the first time. Ken Aston's traffic light epiphany is finally coming to fruition. We also have substitutions, which seems obvious now, but pre-1970, injured or exhausted players couldn't be substituted. This revolutionized football. We also got the Adidas Telstar, the first official match ball, the ball that started it all. The Telstar was Adidas's first attempt at a World Cup ball, and if you ask me, they popped the fuck off with this. It went so hard that the design of this ball is still what most people think of when they imagine a football. So fun fact, this ball was named after the Telstar communications satellite, which was a sphere covered in solar panels that looked very similar to this. This satellite enabled the first live transatlantic television feeds, which means it's the reason the World Cup could be globally broadcast, making this ball and its namesake satellite a television star. The ball was designed to stand out on TV, and boy did it, with record TV audiences thanks to newfound global streaming. And of course, it is in my collection. I will be doing a full unboxing of all of the Adidas balls coming real soon. So from a branding perspective, 1970 also birthed Juanito, designed by Juan Gonzalez Martinez, an advertising designer who actually named the mascot after himself in what I imagine is the world's biggest pat on the back. As the first mascot to be seen in color television, he was designed to be bright, friendly, and to capture the spirit of Mexican culture. The tournament branding overall was heavily influenced by the 1968 Olympics. I mean, why mess with something so iconic, right? This was also the first World Cup that FIFA partnered with Panini, marking a new era of sports collectibles that will sadly come to an end after the 2030 World Cup. I am devastated. Nothing is more iconic than Panini's. So this was the first World Cup to be properly commercialized, and FIFA have simply never stopped since. This was also the tournament that introduced the Fair Play Award, given to Peru for receiving 0 yellow or red cards throughout the tournament. And Africa and Asia were guaranteed spots for the first time, the direct result of the 1966 African boycott. This World Cup would see Morocco, Israel, and El Salvador all make their World Cup debuts, and it was the first tournament to have representation from all 6 continents. It was also the first time an African team won a World Cup match when Morocco beat Bulgaria 1-0. And finally, color TV. The yellow of Brazil's shirts, the green of Mexican pitches, the blues of the sky. All of it arriving in living rooms around the world in color for the first time. So because this was the first color TV broadcast, it was also the most lucrative broadcast deal. The first time TV money was truly powerful enough to influence the tournament itself. So European TV companies, mostly in England, Germany, and Italy, demanded the matches be played in an ideal time zone for their audience. Because, they just aren't as serious as we are in Australia waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning to watch the Socceroos. Fake fan behaviour, if you ask me. So basically this meant that the games had to be played at midday, which doesn't seem that bad until you consider geography. So obviously all the venues were in central Mexico on the Mexican plateau. And this is a history podcast, not a geography podcast. But trust me, because all of this is relevant. Because none of the venues were below 1,500 meters above sea level. This altitude meant that acclimatization was a genuine concern for all teams. Some teams were prepared because they competed at the 1968 Olympics, but with venues between 1,500 and 2,600 meters above sea level, plus hot, rainy conditions exceeding 32 degrees Celsius, this World Cup was a real test for the European teams. So this means that those midday time slots were borderline unbearably hot. And the idea of broadcasters dictating time slots has kind of been par for course ever since. Before we get back to the football, I do want to take a quick detour to talk about the time that English captain Bobby Moore got arrested. So in May 1970, England were in Colombia for a series of friendlies to help them get acclimatized to the Mexican altitude. They arrived on the 18th and had a game in Colombia on the 20th, then another in Ecuador on the 24th, and then were set to head to Mexico City for the World Cup. But then things went awry. So recounts of the incident differ substantially, but basically there was this gift shop in the foyer of the hotel that sold jewelry. And naturally, a bunch of the English players visited and bought gifts. And at 6:25, Bobby Moore went in with Bobby Charlton to find a gift for Charlton's wife. Big mistake. Huge. They looked around but left without buying anything. But when they were standing in the foyer, the shopkeeper came running out and accused them of stealing a bracelet. So Coach Alf Ramsey comes down to handle the situation, and the pair were briefly questioned, but that kind of seemed to be the end of it. They even got apologies for the inconvenience. Both men went on to play the friendly, and traveling journalists buried the story to avoid negative attention on the team. So they then played and won in Ecuador and were preparing to head back to Mexico. So the flight to Mexico took them back through Bogota, and the team's doctor, Neil Phillips, actually suggested that they take a different flight to avoid any further issues in the city. But the pair refused. They felt like them avoiding the city made them look guilty. And to their credit, it kind of would. So they flew back in, checked into the same hotel for an overnight layover, and were sitting down as a team to watch a movie when two plainclothes officers quietly arrested Bobby Moore. So the arrest came after a new witness claimed he saw Bobby Moore take the bracelet while he was looking through the shop window. And it turns out he would have actually been arrested at the airport, but the British ambassador lobbied against it because of the negative press it would cause. So anyway, he's detained, and the team are kind of like, well, we got a World Cup to play. So they go to Mexico without him. But Bobby Charlton, who was with him in the jewelry shop, also manages to leave without incident. And Ramsey didn't actually inform players, staff, or the press of the severity of the matter until they were already on the next flight. Ultimately, Moore was charged with theft and put on house arrest at the Colombian Football Federation president's house. This allowed him to train under the supervision of armed guards. So most people assumed he was innocent, including Coach Ramsey. And even former Brazil coach João Saldanha claimed a similar thing happened to him, with his team having jewelry planted on them in some sort of elaborate extortion sting. So Moore was questioned for hours in Bogota, and ultimately they staged a reenactment with him and the shopkeeper, which is when her story completely fell apart. Because, get this, she claimed he put the bracelet in his left jacket pocket, only to reveal he actually didn't have a left pocket. Ultimately, on May 28, Moore was set free due to a lack of evidence, but promised to cooperate with authorities moving forward. So Moore would ultimately arrive in Guadalajara to meet the rest of the team, who gave him a guard of honor upon arrival. And on June 2, he captained the team to a 1-0 victory over Romania. Despite the case being formally closed, the incident forever marked Moore's legacy, and many people believe this is the reason he was never knighted. And iconically, his wife arrived in Mexico to support him at the World Cup, and she didn't arrive empty-handed. She come bearing a gift for him. a bracelet. So June 7, 1970, Guadalajara, the group stage. Brazil versus England. The defending champions against the greatest team of all time. This was the final before the final, and both teams knew it. It was a group stage match, but it really did feel like a final. So in the first half, Pele shoots a header directed perfectly low and to the right of Gordon Banks. It kicks up off the hard Mexican turf, and Pele screams goal. He's already celebrating, but Banks dives right and gets his right hand under the ball as it rises off the turf. Somehow he manages to angle it up over the crossbar and the ball goes over. Pele stops. He clasps his hands to his head. Quote, "But then this man, Banks, appeared in my sight like a kind of blue phantom. He came from nowhere and he did something I didn't feel was possible. He pushed my header somehow up and over, and I couldn't believe what I saw. Even now when I watch it, I can't believe it. I can't believe how he moved so far, so fast." So the thing is, Banks had noticed when they were training that the hard Mexican surface caused the ball to kick up at a higher angle than he was used to. And he spent extra time practicing that specific movement. In a fraction of a second available to him, he knew he couldn't catch it. The only option was to get his hand under it and angle it up over the bar. At the corner that followed, Pele turned to Banks and said, quote, "I thought that was a goal." And Banks replied, "Me too." Bobby Moore, watching from nearby, grinned and said, "You're getting old, Banksy. You used to catch those." Brazil did, however, score and England would lose 1-0. That save would have no bearing on the outcome of the game. It was just a really interesting side quest, really. Then Banks got food poisoning before the quarterfinal against West Germany, most likely from a contaminated bottle of beer. So he was replaced by Peter Bonetti. England led 2-0. And Beckenbauer pulled one back. Then Seeler scored a bizarre looping header. Then Müller in extra time. West Germany somehow clawed their way back to a 3-2 victory. Perhaps history would be very different if the goalkeeper who made the best save didn't get sick from a bottle of questionable beer. But that's football, baby. So while Brazil were busy dismantling everyone in front of them, West Germany had a problem of their own. Gerd Müller, the bomber. This is a 5'9" stocky guy, not much to look at, built nothing like the idea of a professional footballer. He looked like a tradie. He had no pace, no elegance. He looked like you let your dad have a kick around. Nothing to suggest he was one of the greatest scorers in history. He had this unmatched, almost supernatural ability to score goals. A finisher like no other. He scored 10 goals in 6 games at the 1970 World Cup. Hat-tricks against Bulgaria and Peru. Goals in every stage of the tournament. 10 goals from 6 games. A record that stood for 32 years until Ronaldo at the 2002 World Cup. And when your record gets smashed by Ronaldo, I imagine you're pretty okay with it. It was Müller who equalized for West Germany against England to make it 2-1. It would be Müller who would score twice in the game of the century semi-final, including the winner in extra time. But not even he could stand up against Brazil. He'd ultimately lose the World Cup despite his 10 goals. An individual genius, but no one man is a match for the Brazil squad we saw in 1970. But before we get to that game, let's talk about the semis. Italy versus West Germany. Remember when Italy played World Cup football? Feels like a lifetime ago. Anyway, the semi. Italy versus West Germany. Estadio Azteca, Mexico City, a stunning venue. And fun fact, all 4 teams in the semi-finals this year were former winners. This was the first time it had ever happened, and it happened again in 1990, but this was history. This match has a plaque outside the Estadio Azteca, and it reads, quote, "In this stadium on June 17, 1970, was the most beautiful football match in the world played." Italy were leading 1-0 going into the last minute of normal time. Then Karl-Heinz Snellinger, a defender, scored for West Germany to equalize. Boom, we're in extra time, baby. Feels like the 2026 World Cup. 5 goals in 30 minutes, 3 lead changes. Madness. Oh, and then there is Franz Beckenbauer. I want to do a whole episode on him. But he played the entirety of extra time with a dislocated shoulder. His arm is just strapped to his body because West Germany had used both of their substitutions. We had substitutions by 1970, but not enough for this. So he played on in agony rather than leaving his team with 10 men. And that energy really sums up his career. He'd come back the next World Cup and win the thing, and then win again as manager, one of only 3 players to do so in World Cup history. Ultimately, Italy won the game 4-3, and it remains one of the greatest matches ever played. The 1970 final was Brazil versus Italy. June 21, Estadio Azteca, 412 people pack out the stadium. Just 3 months earlier, Brazil lost a friendly to a club side and got booed off the pitch. Then, with just 75 days until kickoff, they got a new coach under a dictatorship. Pele entered the tournament knowing that this was his last, and Tostão nearly missed selection altogether. But somehow, despite all odds, they had made it to the final. And now, this unassuming team was about to do something nobody had done before. They were about to win their 3rd World Cup. Pele scored 4 goals and made 6 assists, involved in over half of Brazil's 19 goals. During the semi-final against Uruguay, Pele received the ball and the Uruguayan keeper raced off his line. Pele let the ball run past him without touching it, going to the left of the goalkeeper while the ball went to the right. Then he went around the other side, collected the ball and shot. It just went wide. He had dummied the goalkeeper out of the game and still missed. Are you kidding me? Talk about a goal that never happened. So Pele would say afterwards, I think about that moment often. What I did, the idea was right. The ball just didn't agree. And then the final itself. Pele scored the opener with a header, out-leaping Italian defender Bergnick, who later said, quote, I told myself before the game, he's made of skin and bones just like everyone else. I was wrong. Mans wasn't real. He was built different. Italy would equalize, but Brazil would go on to score 3 more. The last one is the one that really seals the deal. Brazil would ultimately win 4-1, with fans invading the pitch. Pele is paraded around wearing an enormous sombrero in the most Mexican photo you've ever fucking seen. Rivellino said, quote, it was madness. They stripped the shirt I was wearing right off my back. I fainted and had to be helped up. Absolute scenes. So Brazil winning the World Cup for the 3rd time meant they received the Jules Rimet trophy permanently. The trophy that had been carried across the Atlantic in a bag, that had spent the war in a shoebox under a bed, that had been stolen from a church hall and found by a dog named Pickles, was finally Brazil's forever. Carlos Alberto kissed it in front of 107,000 people in Mexico City that day. He was the last person to lift it legitimately. Brazil would get to keep the trophy in perpetuity, a gift to commemorate their historic feat. But in 1983, it was stolen from the Brazilian Football Confederation in Rio de Janeiro and has never been found. But that's another story. Mexico 1970 is the World Cup that football keeps coming back to. This wasn't just football. This was an artistic demonstration. Pele would go on to baptize the 1970 squad as, quote, the beautiful team. It's the only name that fits. Tostão would give his winner's medal to his eye surgeon, and Mueller would ultimately score 10 goals but still lose. And somewhere in Rio de Janeiro in 1983, someone took the trophy that represented all of that and melted it down. Or sold it. Or buried it. Or maybe it's sitting on someone's shelf. All we really know is that the Jules Rimet trophy is gone. But the stories we have from Mexico 1970 are not. The next episode is West Germany 1974, a tournament that played in the shadow of a political assassination, and the birth of total football. And one of the most controversial matches in World Cup history, played between 2 Germanys that were technically the same country. And that's World Cup history.